Hello everyone, welcome to the series on the history of English literature, and in this video we are going to discuss the development of poetry in the Victorian Age. Introduction. The Victorian Age 1837 to 1901 witnessed a rich and extensive output of poetry, building on the traditions of the Romantic era and responding to the complex social, intellectual and cultural changes of their own time. Victorian poets produced a body of work notable for its variety, thematic breadth and technical experimentation. Though the period did not bring forth revolutionary new forms to rival earlier poetic breakthroughs, it nonetheless saw significant refinements and adaptations of inherited styles. This era's poets balanced lyrical expression with descriptive depth, extended narrative forms, and an evolving sense of artistic purpose that reflected the more contemplative spirit of the age. Lyrical poetry and form. In terms of sheer quantity and diversity, the lyrical poetry of the Victorian era is vast. Yet, from a formal perspective, there was comparatively little innovation. Alfred Lord Tennyson, a central figure of the period, largely followed the methods and forms established by John Keats, adhering to a smooth, measured style that favored musicality, polished diction, and gentle emotional appeals. While Tennyson did not significantly alter the established lyrical forms, poets like Robert Browning and A.C. Swinburne contributed greater complexity in terms of metrical structure and verse technique. Browning's work often employed intricate stanzaic patterns and challenging syntactical arrangements, while Swinburne became known for his long flowing lines and the subtle interplay of sound and sense. These poetic refinements can be viewed as careful elaborations on romantic foundations rather than as radical departures. Descriptive and narrative poetry. Where the Victorians truly distinguished themselves was in descriptive and narrative verse. The subject matter of Victorian poetry showed a remarkable expansiveness, drawing on an eclectic array of times, places and traditions. Robert Browning and William Morris, for instance, drew inspiration from distant historical periods and far-flung locales. Browning's dramatic monologues and narrative poems animate characters from the Renaissance and beyond, exploring psychological depths and moral ambiguities. Morris, on the other hand, engaged with medieval and legendary sources, infusing them with a freshness that transcended mere imitation. Such descriptive poetry ranged from the cultivated elegance of Tennyson's English countryside scenes to the bolder impressionism of poets like Walt Whitman, whose indirect influence helped liberate English verse from strict conventions of perspective and style. The Pre-Raphaelites, notably D.G. Rossetti, William Morris and Swinburne, contributed to this shift by uniting several features, medieval or mythic themes, richly colored pictorial effects, and a studied melodic simplicity into a unified aesthetic. Their approach blended the visual and the verbal, producing poetry that often feels like painting in words. Victorian poets excelled in these descriptive arts, reflecting the era's more meditative tendencies rather than the Romantic era's immediate, passionate lyricism. Efforts at extended narrative forms. The Victorian period also witnessed attempts to create longer narrative poems. Tennyson considered reviewing the grand epic, yet his epic aspiration never fully materialized in a cohesive long work. Instead, he produced idylls, shorter narrative segments. Most famously, in Idylls of the King, a cycle of poems about Arthurian legends. These idyls are unified in theme and subject but lack the continuous narrative drive of a classical epic. In contrast, Browning's The Ring and the Book can be viewed as a kind of psychological epic. Rather than foregrounding action and heroism, Browning's narrative poem is a complex mosaic of voices, each recounting a central crime and trial from a different angle, thus placing emotional nuance, moral uncertainty, and character introspection at the heart of what might otherwise have been a traditional narrative. The poem's core vitality comes from the interplay of competing perspectives, shifting the focus from external exploits to internal moral landscapes. William Morris's The Earthly Paradise represented yet another approach to narrative verse. Morris revisited old romantic tales, much in the manner of Chaucer, rejuvenating familiar stories with a Victorian sensibility that valued atmosphere, detail, and emotional resonance over direct moral instruction. Here, narrative poetry reclaimed some of its medieval and Renaissance heritage, filtering it through the Victorian lens of cultural nostalgia and aesthetic craftsmanship. Conclusion: the development of poetry in the Victorian age thus emerges as a study in continuities and nuances rather than one of bold formal revolutions. The poets took up and modified the lyric forms inherited from the Romantics, polished descriptive techniques to a high sheen, and explored new narrative possibilities shaped by modern sensibilities. While there may have been no singular, groundbreaking style to define Victorian poetry as distinctly as some earlier and later movements, the period's strength lay in its capacity to synthesize diverse influences. From Tennyson's refined lyricism and the pre-Raphaelite fusion of visual and verbal artistry to Browning's psychological complexity and Morris's romantic storytelling, Victorian poetry stands as a rich tapestry, rooted in tradition, but inventive in detail, reflective in tone, and eloquently responsive to the cultural and intellectual currents of its time. So this was the discussion on the development of poetry in the Victorian age. We will meet in the next video and discuss some other topic. Until then, goodbye and thank you.